Thank you very much, Herman, for welcoming me, and thank you to all of you for being here. I know right after lunch on the last afternoon of a conference is everyone's favorite time for a lecture. So I'll make sure to have a really tough quiz at the end. But yeah, thank you very much for engaging with the questions this morning. I'm going to be talking today about a section from my ongoing book project that I've been working on during my time here in Austria. The book project is called Freedom's Generation, Coming of Age in the Era of Emancipation. It's a project that explores the lives of young people who grew up during the American Civil War. So essentially I look at people born between about 1850 and 1860 in the United States, people who would have been too young to serve in the military legally or too young generally to have families of their own, although there were some exceptions to both of those cases. And I ask what it meant to be part of this first generation to come of age in the United States in an era of national freedom. The project has two parts. So the first part is exploring this generation's experiences from about 1850 until 1880. During the Civil War and in the aftermath of the Civil War, I use letters and diaries, children's literature, things adults write about children, anything that I can find to kind of reconstruct young people's experiences in these years. And I'm happy to talk more about this part of the project and the kinds of sources I use in the question and answer session. The second half of the project is about memory. So when this particular generation became adults, what role did they take on in the country in shaping how people remembered the conflict? And how did they use their memories of Civil War childhoods to shape national politics, ideas of race, ideas of freedom? And that's a bit what I'm going to be talking about today. So my talk today is from chapter 6 of the book project. In that second half where I'm focusing on memory, this chapter deals with the turn of the 20th century in particular, so around 1900. And I ask, when these people who were born around 1850, 1860, when they became adults, when they reached middle age, what role did they take in the national conversation around Civil War memory? And this particular chapter, chapter 6, I want to kind of make two main points, and I'm going to try to make those two main points today in this relatively short talk in only 20 minutes or so. But the first point is that, in fact, in this moment of Civil War memory that shaped the national commemorative landscape that we still live with today, the most important people fighting those battles were not necessarily people who had fought in the Civil War itself, but people who had been children. And then the second point that this chapter makes is that by thinking about this particular point around the beginning of the 20th century through a generational lens, by thinking about this particular group of people who grew up during the war, we can better understand the possibilities of African American resistance to violence and resistance to dominant narratives about the Civil War. This period around the turn of the 20th century came to be known as the nadir of African American history, and I think that the way that I'm writing about this generation leads us to kind of rethink that term a little bit, and I'm going to move more to that later on. Okay, so first, a little bit of context about the turn of the 20th century and the landscape of Civil War memory. So this image is the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial. It's on the Boston Common in Massachusetts. It's a memorial that was erected or unveiled in 1897. And it commemorates Robert Gould Shaw, who was the commanding officer of the Massachusetts 54th, which was one of the first black regiments in the Union or Northern Army. Depicts Robert Gould Shaw riding on this horse and the black troops who were in the regiment behind him. It's unusual for this moment in US history because it's a monument place and a prominent place that commemorates the service of black Civil War soldiers. And scholars have talked a lot about this monument as sort of representing a moment of possibility at this time, as against the grain of memory that was shifting toward reconciliation rather than remembering the Civil War as a war for emancipation. But I want to think about it a little bit differently. So to me, this construction or this unveiling of this monument in 1897 represents the passing of a torch from one generation to the next. This moment in 1897, when this monument was unveiled, was the passing of the torch from the people who fought in the Civil War to their children. So when this monument is unveiled, The main speakers are all people who had been children during the Civil War. So one of the speakers, for example, is Josiah Quincy, who was mayor of Boston at the time in 1897. He had been a child during the Civil War. Booker T. Washington, one of the most prominent black activists in the United States at the time, he speaks at the unveiling. He had been a child during the Civil War. Augustus St. Gaudens, the sculptor who designs the memorial, he had been a child during the Civil War. Charles McKim, who's the architect of the memorial, again, same idea. So something's happening in this moment in 1897 when a new generation is taking over the mantle of controlling or fighting over the national narrative about what the Civil War had meant. And this is the physical landscape of Civil War memory that we still live with today. So this same moment, 1897, is often thought of by scholars or talked about by scholars as the nadir of African American history because it was the height of racial violence and disenfranchisement in the United States. Between the 1870s and 1950s, there were 4,000 extra-legal lynchings of African Americans in the United States, a campaign of racial violence that was intended to limit political rights for African Americans. This was also accompanied by a campaign to limit the right to vote for African Americans through the legal system. And this was unfolding all in this same moment around 1897 and in the early years of the 20th century as this new generation was taking over fights over Civil War memory. And those two things are deeply intertwined. So the way that Civil War memory got talked about at a national level was used to justify or fight against this racial violence. And what I'm talking about in this chapter is the fact that we can only understand this struggle over violence, over politics, over ideas of race and freedom by thinking about who exactly was doing the fighting and how they were engaging in that fight through this process of remembering their childhoods in particular. So the first person to call this time period between about 1890 and 1920 the nadir, or the low point of African American history, is a scholar, Rayford Logan. He writes a book in 1954 calling this time period the nadir. And that's part of what I'm interested in as well. How does a time period come to be conceptualized in a particular way, and how did people think about it at the time? So this national struggle over rights for African Americans, as I said, had a parallel struggle over Civil War memory. And this parallel struggle over Civil War memory, one side of the struggle was involved in creating what came to be known as the lost cause. So this term, the lost cause, was first used right around the end of the Civil War to describe the Confederate loss, the loss of the South in the Civil War, as something that was physically lost, but not intellectually lost. The Civil War continued on as a fight through other means. This idea of the Civil War as ongoing, as the South potentially winning the Civil War in the long term, is something that really picked up in the 1890s. And again, it's this next generation, it's this group of people that I'm talking about that became the key figures in crafting the lost cause, in creating visions of the Confederacy as something that was ongoing in the 1890s. So this is just one example I have up here, a book called Red Rock by Thomas Nelson Page. Thomas Nelson Page was one of the most prominent figures in what came to be known as the plantation school of fiction writers, basically white Southern authors who were creating a romantic vision of the Old South, who were essentially arguing that things had been better before slavery ended. In this book, Thomas Nelson Page writes a fictionalized version of the aftermath of the Civil War, and one thing that happens in the novel is that a black man is punished for being accused of raping a white woman by lynching. And this confluence of fiction and what was actually happening on the ground in the South at this point in time is a really important part of the story. The stories that we tell about the past are used to justify real-life violence. And that was the struggle that this generation was engaging in the 1890s. White Southerners like Thomas Nelson Page, people like those who were joining the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which was founded in the 1880s, They were using this alternative vision of what the Civil War meant, and in particular, what their own Civil War childhoods had meant to justify the ongoing process of disenfranchisement and violence in the South. So another example, Mildred Rutherford, she becomes the historian of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the early 20th century. She had also been a child during the Civil War, and she says that in order to achieve their goals, every Southern library should have the novels of Thomas Nelson Page. So there was this very concerted campaign on the part of white Southern members of this generation to craft a certain vision of memory that would in turn be used to create a different political environment. So this generation that I talk about, I discuss black and white children in the North and South, and this was a generational struggle that unfolded all over the course of their lives about what their own childhoods would mean, about what Civil War memory would mean. And what I talk about in this chapter is, in particular, how did African American members of this generation resist this lost cause narrative that was unfolding, and in doing so, how did they resist the violence that was unfolding in the South? And they did so through a number of means, through writing, through literature, and art, and I want to talk about just a few examples of that resistance. That resistance, of course, unfolded on a political scale as well by attempting to vote, by engaging in lawsuits, by holding parades and protests. But these alternative, but these forms of protest became less and less possible in this era as people were threatened more and more by violence. So one thing that happened in these years is that people were developing alternative forms of resistance. One form of resistance was memory. So as the lost cause memory of the Civil War was crafted, as the war having been a tragedy for the South, as the war being a tragedy in general, African American memoirists tried to preserve a memory of the war as a triumph, a war for emancipation that was the ultimate jubilee, the ultimate moment of celebration in African American history and American history more broadly. So I write a bit about this guy, Jacob Stroyer, born enslaved in South Carolina around 1850. And so he first writes a memoir in 1879. So he's still quite young. He's only about 30 years old. But you can already see here, this is the cover of, or the title page of the 1885 version. He's already revising it. And ultimately he has 4 editions of his memoir, with the last edition in 1898. And each time he revises his memoir, he adds in more and more stories about the war itself and more stories about emancipation. So as the political situation becomes more difficult, becomes more tenuous in the United States, it becomes more and more important to remember particular aspects of emancipation through memoir. So this is one strategy that people are using in these years to resist dominant narratives. And African American memoir in these years is flourishing. In particular, Booker T. Washington writes a memoir as well, but there are numerous other examples of this in these years, written by those who had grown up during the Civil War. Again, protesting in public, voting, engaging in political life becomes more and more difficult. So people are engaging in resistance and protest through other means. And another possibility is through literature. So Pauline Hopkins, perhaps the most well-known black woman novelist of these years, writes a novel called Contending Forces, which is in some ways about her own experiences of growing up around the time period of the Civil War, but is also about this larger national narrative of emancipation and about the sort of failed promise of black freedom and the way that the nation has let her down. So she tells this story of Reconstruction's possibilities. She tells a story about from the 1860s into the 1890s, how things have turned toward violence. And this novel is very popular. And it's another example of how people tried to tell stories about emancipation through other formats when voting and public protest became less possible. Another prominent author who writes novels, basically historical fiction novels in these years, Charles Chestnut, a black man who is born free in the North, writes similar stories that fictionalize accounts of Reconstruction. And through fiction, through memoir, through these various means, people are trying to preserve a narrative of emancipation and alternative history. And this is a generational struggle, a conflict that they're engaging in with people who were born in the same era as them, who are fighting to create a lost cause narrative of the Civil War. And this is, part of the story I'm trying to tell in this chapter is a story of how hope and possibility are preserved in what comes to be called the low point of African American history. Another possibility, another form of resistance that exists in these years is resistance through painting. And this is kind of a dark painting, so I'm not sure how well it shows up here. But this is a painting by Henry Ossawa Tanner, one of the most well-known African-American artists in these years. Tanner is born free in Pennsylvania, eventually trains with Thomas Eakins, a very well-known painter in the 1870s in Philadelphia. Tanner moves to Paris, and in 1896 he displays this painting in Paris, which is a depiction of the story Daniel in the Lion's Den. So the most prominent subject in Tanner's paintings is this kind of biblical thematic matter. He doesn't do a lot of paintings dealing specifically with the Civil War or Reconstruction or African American life in the US. But scholars have talked about this painting as being part of this same moment of resistance in 1896, thinking about how the story of Daniel in the Lion's Den, who is a Jewish man who's persecuted for his beliefs, thrown in jail with lions for praying to his God, and saved by God for his righteousness, despite the fact that he's facing this potential horrific violence. And this is thought of in general as sort of an analogy about what African Americans in the South and throughout the United States are facing in these years. So this is a prominent sort of biblical story that gets talked about a lot in these years, and it's a way in which, through analogy, Tanner is engaging in resistance as well. So through analogy, through these various literary and artistic and memoir genres, people are constructing alternative narratives, and they're preserving an alternative vision of what the Civil War had meant in the face of this lost cause mythology that's developing, and in the face of significant racial violence and disenfranchisement in the South. And this story is used widely. Pauline Hopkins, who I mentioned on the previous slide, she actually writes a modernized play version of Daniel in the Lion's Den as well. And essentially, African American activists in these years are using any means necessary to provide hope and to preserve memories of emancipation, not only for themselves, but for the next generation. So, as I said earlier, this chapter is kind of trying to make two main points. First of all, this idea that the turn of the 20th century represents a passing of the torch. It represents a changing of the guard as far as who's controlling narratives of Civil War memory. And that's especially important because the national landscape in the United States, as far as we know it today, as far as the monuments that we walk past today, whether it's in Boston or New Orleans, South Carolina, wherever it is in the United States, most of those monuments were put up in these early years of the 20th century, whether they're monuments commemorating the Union or the Confederacy, and they were put up mainly by people who had grown up during the Civil War. And that means it's important to ask why it was so essential for these people to commemorate their childhood experiences in this way. And the other point that I'm trying to make in this chapter is that by thinking about a generational approach, by thinking about how experiences of this particular generation change over time, we can better understand the meanings and experiences of African American resistance in these years, why African American activists used particular forms of resistance through art, through literature, through memoir, when other forms were not possible, and why they tried to tell the stories that they did. In doing so, I also, as I said at the beginning of the talk, want to kind of reconceptualize this term nadir. There's no question that this era was a time period of devastating racial violence, a time period of devastation, of disenfranchisement, and it makes sense to call it the nadir of African American history. I'm not arguing against that. But it's important to think about how people conceptualized it at the time, and in particular that they saw that things could get worse, and because they resisted in the ways that they did, things eventually got better. It was the ideas of hope and the memories of the Civil War as a war for emancipation that provided inspiration for them to keep fighting and provided inspiration for the next generations to keep fighting as well. In particular, 2 generations later or so, the civil rights activists that we think about in the 1960s were often drawing on these memories of the Civil War as a war for emancipation that had been preserved by this generation that I'm talking about here. And ultimately, this chapter and the book project as a whole is about how history gets used and the possibilities of the past. The 1890s and the turn of the 20th century tells a story about how narratives are connected to violence. Because the lost cause memory of the Civil War that was created by members of this generation became dominant, that allowed for the prevalence of racial violence against African Americans in this time period. And because African Americans belonging to this generation resisted that violence through their own memories, people were eventually able to push back against that violence as the 20th century unfolded. So whether a time period is a low or a high is never fixed. It's something that changes in interpretation over time. And thinking about the concept of generations, thinking about this particular generation helps us to understand ongoing struggles over Civil War memory and how important it is to fight over how that particular conflict is remembered, and to think about as well how we understand our own childhoods and the political stakes involved in that kind of memory. So that's what I wanted to say today. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.